The night was loud, restless, and glittering. Beneath the chandeliers of the most exclusive clubs in Las Vegas, a man few had ever heard of moved like a shadow wrapped in light. His name was Jho Low. To some, he was a mystery from Malaysia. To others, he was the man who could buy anything, anyone, at any time. When bottles of champagne arrived at tables faster than the guests could drink them, when entire sections of the casino seemed to bow to his command, it was his money that made the impossible happen. What no one realized was that this wealth did not belong to him. It belonged to a nation. Long before he became one of the world's most wanted men, Jho Low was a boy from the island of Penang. He was born into a family of privilege, but not royalty. His father had built a respectable fortune, enough to send the young Jho overseas to Harrow, one of England's most prestigious boarding schools. For the boy from Malaysia, Harrow was a world of old names and ancient wealth, where classmates bore titles that stretched back centuries. He was surrounded by princes and heirs of oil dynasties. Next to them, he was just the son of a millionaire. But Jho Low possessed something rare, an eye for power and a hunger for acceptance. He learned quickly that in certain circles, appearances could be everything. At Harrow, he staged his first great illusion. He invited his wealthy friends to Malaysia for the summer. To impress them, he borrowed a 160-foot yacht from a family friend, replaced the photographs on board with pictures of himself, and pretended the vessel belonged to him. His guests never suspected the deception. That summer planted a dangerous seed in Jho Low's mind. With enough bravado and the right illusion, doors would open that had no reason to open. He carried that lesson to America, where he enrolled at Wharton. There, too, he shaped his persona with careful calculation. He drove a Lexus convertible he barely afforded, let rumors circulate that he was a Malaysian prince, and wrote financial articles copied word for word from Wall Street analysts, articles that somehow went unquestioned and earned him praise as a brilliant stock picker. Everything about him was a performance, and the audience, classmates, professors, even journalists, applauded without realizing the script had been stolen. But the real genius of Jho Low was not the lies he told. It was the friendships he forged. He sought out the children of oil magnates, princes of the Gulf, and the heirs of empires. He offered them favors, solutions, and the thrill of his extravagant parties. One of his most important friendships came from his school days at Harrow. Reza Aziz, the stepson of Najib Razak, a man climbing the ladder of Malaysian politics. Through Reza, Jho Low found a door into the corridors of power in his homeland, and soon he would use that connection to stage one of the boldest financial heists the world had ever seen. Yet even as he built his network, there was something unsettling about him. At his college birthday party, he rented out a nightclub, plastered his name across the invitations, and staged a night of indulgence that made him look like a man of boundless wealth. But behind the scenes, he stalled the owners for months because he could not pay the full bill. It didn't matter, the illusion was complete. His classmates only remembered the glamour. They believed he was one of them. And Jho Low knew belief was more powerful than truth. By the time he graduated, he was already traveling the Middle East meeting royal families and sitting across from the guardians of sovereign wealth funds, massive pools of money belonging to nations often opaque, often unregulated, and waiting for the right person to exploit them. He asked questions about power, about who controlled the money, about the fragile seams of trust that held billions in place. He was not yet the man who would rob a country, but the foundation was being laid. And in Malaysia, Najib Razak was climbing. Soon he would become Prime Minister. And when he did, Jho Low would be waiting, armed with charm, illusion, and a plan that would make him both infamous and untouchable. But how does a man with no real fortune, no crown, and no empire convince the world he is wealthier than kings? That is the question that haunted those who met him, and the question that set the stage for his greatest deception. He studied power like other people studied books, patiently, obsessively, memorizing its grammar and its hidden punctuation. When Najib Razak became Prime Minister, Jho Low stepped from the periphery into the inner circle, not with an official title, but with a promise. He would bring investment, prestige, and momentum to a country hungry for growth. The plan, he whispered, sounded simple: a national fund that could invest like the great sovereign vehicles of the Gulf, a modern engine for Malaysia's ambitions. It would be called One Malaysia Development Berhad, 1MDB, an emblem worn like a badge of destiny. He arrived not as a bureaucrat but as a problem solver, a discreet advisor who could open doors most people couldn't find. He knew the rooms where money flowed in rivers, and he knew how to speak in the measured tone that convinced powerful men the current was moving their way. He courted the family, showed loyalty, paid for celebrations that signaled devotion, and made himself indispensable. On paper, he was only an advisor. In the quiet corridors, he held the keys. The first deal was presented as a masterstroke. Through his relationships in the Middle East, he proposed a joint venture with a Saudi partner, PetroSaudi, promising energy riches and global clout. $1 billion would be wired from Malaysia's nascent fund into the venture, a bold opening move that told the world 1MDB had arrived. Approvals came quicker than questions. The country's leader believed in the promise. The advisors nodded in chorus. The bankers' signatures fell like rain. And then the money moved. 300 million went where it was supposed to go. The remaining 700 million slipped sideways, away from the joint venture and into an account held by a quiet shell with a comforting name, Good Star Limited. It suggested stability. It was anything but. The paperwork said this was a requirement, a pre-existing obligation, a step in a complicated dance of oil and debt. The paperwork lied. The shell was his. The share certificates were designed to leave no fingerprints, and the beneficiary kept to the shadows. The National Fund had just paid a private man a staggering sum, and almost no one knew. He had studied the weaknesses in the system with the patience of a jeweler reading flaws in a diamond, jurisdictions that prized secrecy, banks that admired prestige, auditors eager to be reassured. Over years he had learned that a confident narrative often passes as truth, and that the appearance of state-to-state partnership can lull even seasoned watchdogs to sleep. He surrounded himself with trusted loyalists who would not pull at loose threads. He cultivated a politician whose re-election would require deep pockets and grand gestures. And because he understood that favors must be repaid swiftly, he repaid them with other people's money. The joint venture went public with fanfare. Speeches praised a new era. Diagrams promised oil and opportunity. Quietly, the accounts hardened like cooling steel around the misdirection. On paper, everything looked crisp. In reality, the first heist was complete, not as a smash and grab, but as a signature and a wire. That night, far from the conference rooms and the national headlines, he looked out over a city that seemed to glow on command. Somewhere in the distance, a private jet was being readied. Somewhere else, a gallery owner was unlocking a vault. He had discovered what he really wanted, an empire of approval, the kind that only money could buy. But money taken this way carries a new cost. Once spent, it demands more. If 700 million could pass through the walls without a sound, what louder thing might follow when the world began to listen? The appetite arrived before dawn, and he did not sleep. He bought yachts that turned harbors into statements, and houses that made every room an announcement. He gambled the way he spent, recklessly calm, as if loss itself were just another guest at his table. In 8 months alone, He burned through the kind of money that would fund hospitals, schools, entire neighborhoods. He did it with a smile, and his guests learned there was always more where that came from. He paid celebrities to attend his evenings, not for the conversation, but for the gravity they lent to his orbit. A singer stepped out of a cake and sang his name as if it were a national anthem. Actors drifted through the lights like constellations. Models laughed against a backdrop of noise that felt like victory. He sent 23 bottles to a star's table because he liked the symmetry of excess. He returned to the same cities again and again until the doormen greeted him like routine weather. And yet he remained oddly distant in the center of his own festival. Guests noticed the way he watched, how he asked, if they were comfortable, whether the food was good, if the music needed to be louder, as though he were adjusting a painting on a wall. He was the host and the audience at once, chasing a feeling that receded each time he reached for it. Hollywood was not a world he merely admired. It was a stage he intended to own. He stood behind a new production company with silent money, content to let others pose for the cameras while he worked the wires. When a legendary director and a beloved leading man struggled to secure a studio's blessing for a risky film about greed and spectacle, he offered a solution, fund it outright, and promise freedom. The irony gleamed like a jewel, a movie celebrating excess, paid for with money diverted from a national dream. On awards night, the star thanked him by name. His smile was small, almost private, the smile of a magician who has performed the trick for himself. He bought a stake in music publishing, joined advisory boards, walked into rooms that used to be closed, and nodded as if he had always belonged there. He told himself it was the beginning of a legitimate empire, a future where profits might backfill the pit he had dug. He believed that if he moved fast enough, success would overtake suspicion. There were whispers. A man whose life was once a spreadsheet looked around his party and sensed the wrongness in the air. No one spends earned money like this. But whispers are not subpoenas, and the music drowned them out. He was called the Asian Great Gatsby, admired for the bravura of his spectacle, and pitied, quietly, for the sadness beneath it. The people who knew him best said he was generous to a fault, eager to please, and lonely in ways he could not admit. When the calendar turned, he decided to celebrate New Year's twice in a single night, once in Sydney, then again in Las Vegas, chasing midnight across time zones like a man trying to catch a feeling that kept slipping through his hands. He succeeded. The countdowns were perfect. The photographs were radiant. But dawn always comes, and dawn asks a question money hates to hear. What next? He had turned fame into a shield and excess into a language, but the next chapter would require a new translator, the kind that wore a pinstripe suit and returned phone calls from governments. He needed a conduit that offered respectability on contact, a name that could sell billions with a signature and calm the markets with a glance. He found it in the mirrored offices of a storied bank, men and women trained to measure risk with rulers of reputation. He flew their executive on a private jet, introduced him to a royal, staged the trip like a dream. Then he made the ask, help 1MDB raise money through bonds, lots of it, and quickly. On their own, the bonds were hard to love. The fund had no credit history, no proven engine, only promises and a leader's name attached to it. But promise can be dressed. He stitched a partnership with a well-known wealth fund from the Gulf, layering credibility on top of urgency, pairing Malaysia's ambition with the dignity of a proven institution. The package looked handsome. It looked safe. Investors lined up. In 2012, they bought $3.5 billion worth, the proceeds supposedly destined for power plants and national progress. In 2013, they bought $3 billion more. Between those two pools flowed a tide of money that almost no one fully traced. Not because they couldn't, but because they trusted the logos on the cover of the prospectus. He knew that trust was the most powerful currency on earth, and he spent it lavishly. The technique was elegant in its audacity. He built shells with names that sounded like blue-chip titans, close enough to pass at a glance. He moved funds through offshore havens like a man walking through adjoining rooms, locking each door behind him. He layered transactions until origin dissolved into mist. He used client accounts protected by confidentiality, trusting that the law's desire to protect would become his camouflage. And above all, he leveraged a quiet truth. Transactions between entities with flags attached draw fewer questions than those between ordinary companies. People hesitate to ask governments for receipts. Fees flowed to the bank in amounts that would later stun observers. Bonuses were paid. Careers shone brighter. The fund's losses, meanwhile, deepened like a shadow stretching across a public square. He diverted billions through the labyrinth and fed the machine that had brought him this far. Houses, art, travel, loyalty. A loyalist in a high office received his share to steady the hand that signed the approvals. Everyone who helped was rewarded. Everyone who looked away was thanked. Inside his private world, the stakes rose without fanfare. You cannot spend at that altitude and remain still. The demand for more money behaves like weather, unforgiving, inevitable. He told himself he was buying time, buying legitimacy, buying a future in which the investments he now controlled would pay returns that cleansed the past. But time is not a commodity, it is a judge. And judges listen when someone finally talks. The first crack did not appear in a bank or a ministry. It appeared in an inbox on a screen, in the subject lines of leaked messages that began to reorder the story. It began with emails, a small avalanche of revelations delivered to reporters who knew how to read between lines. The messages named names, mapped transfers, and pried open the sealed rooms where the wires had been pulled. Questions became headlines. Headlines became outrage. On the streets of Kuala Lumpur, citizens stood shoulder to shoulder and asked for answers that would not come. They had been promised a future and dignity. They had received debt and silence. He felt the shift before it was visible. Invitations slowed, advisors urged caution. He slipped into the creases of the world where money buys discretion. Villa compounds, borrowed apartments, borrowed names. The phone still rang, but the calls grew clipped. Loneliness crept in like a draft under a locked door. A relationship ended quietly, the way doors close in hotels where the hallways are carpeted to swallow sound. At home, the political tide turned. The ruling party, long considered unassailable, lost an election for the first time in living memory. The man he had once made indispensable found himself facing a new reality in which his title no longer protected him. When officials arrived, they found rooms full of proof that luxury had been fed by streams of money that did not belong to those who wore it. Jewelry, watches, handbags, cash. The spectacle of it did not tell the whole story. The ledgers did. Courts followed, so did denials. A banker once courted with private jets admitted crimes in a plea that sent shockwaves through boardrooms. The old bank tried to argue the scandal was the work of a few, not a culture, but the numbers resisted the narrative. Investigators in multiple countries began to thread needles through the maze of accounts, a slow, relentless stitching that pulled the pattern into view. And Jho Low vanished. He did not vanish like a myth. He vanished like a man who understood that visibility had become a liability. There were sightings, whispers of a private dinner, a party far from cameras, a quiet life propped up by reserves that would last years. But he was no longer the master of rooms that bent to his will. He lived inside borrowed time, a guest in spaces designed for other names. The damage, however, remained where it had always mattered most. The fund meant to seed prosperity had instead seeded obligation. A nation's hopes had been turned into paper promises held by outsiders, while the tangible fruits of the fund, schools, clinics, jobs, stood delayed or undone. Ordinary people carried the cost. Investigators spoke carefully about recovery, about asset seizures, about accountability. None of it returned years to the ledger, and none of it changed a simple truth. What had been stolen was not just money, it was trust. He had always believed that approval could be purchased, that belonging could be built out of gifts and favors, that respect would come if he spent enough to summon it. But respect cannot be wired. It must be earned over time, and time is what he ran out of. In private moments, those who had once called him generous now imagined him anxious, rehearsing explanations to a mirror that offered no answers. The man who wanted the world's attention had given the world a reason to look for him and keep looking. Somewhere, a phone still lights up with a new message, a proposition, a pathway back into the game. He knows the temptation, and he knows the cost. He also knows that the most expensive thing he ever bought was the version of himself he could never afford. He did not storm a vault with a mask and a weapon. He did not drill through floors, silence alarms, or flee into the night with a bag over his shoulder. He robbed in daylight with contracts and credentials, in boardrooms that smelled of polished wood and careful lies. He learned that if you can persuade the guardians that you belong, the gates open themselves. He learned that some institutions will accept any story if the fees are high enough. He learned that nations, like people, can be seduced by the glow of prestige, and that the glow can blind. The hunt continues. There are warrants and red notices, filings and hearings, art returned, and yachts sold. Asset by asset, the map of his empire is being redrawn by law. It is not the final word, but it is a sentence. And somewhere behind a guarded door, the man at the center of it all reads news about himself in a language that now sounds foreign: regret, restitution, return. He once wanted the world to remember his name. It will, just not the way he imagined. Count them all: the planes, the parties, the paintings, the properties, the promises. The ledger balances in a different currency now, not dollars, not bonds, consequences.